We are very lucky today to invite to the MSSR 2020 stage Siegfried Hecker, who will be speaking with us today about his experience in his scientific work with nuclear weapons and nuclear nonproliferation, and really putting a cap on that chapter of this summer's symposium for us. Siegfried Hecker is a professor research in the Department of Management, Science and Engineering and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He was co-director of CISAC from 2007 to 2012. From 1986 to 1997, Dr. Hecker served as the 5th director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Dr. Hecker is an internationally recognized expert in plutonium science, global threat reduction, and nuclear security. In lieu of a full introduction that I would usually do, I instead today would like to share with you a video. And that video will serve as setting the stage, kind of an introduction to today being a very important day. It's the anniversary, 75th anniversary of the Trinity explosion, the Trinity detonation, which we'll learn about in just one moment here.
KRSN AM 1490, Los Alamos.
And there goes the last DJ who plays when he wants to play.
65 years ago today at 5:29:45 a.m. Mountain War Time, on July 16, 1945, the world's first atomic bomb exploded over Jornado del Muerto, which is the New Mexico desert down near White Sands, New Mexico.
Always when I look back on July 16th, I just absolutely marvel at what those men and women were able to accomplish in 27 months. It was just incredible, scientific, engineering, and societally. So that's the first thing that goes through my mind on the 16th. The second is the reminder of the enormous devastation of a nuclear weapon. And so the fact that, you know, when you split the nucleus, you automatically gain a factor of millions over every other energy form that you have.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
High-speed cameras evolved right here because they wanted to see the very first instance of an atomic explosion. And I've got the Marley camera. I used to run it in the lab. This is the shutter. I ran that at 3,000 RPM. And here's the lenses, and these are mirrors. The mirrors put the images on 35 millimeter film that lies around the outside of this.
3, 2, 1, now.
We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
Professor Hecker, everybody. Bit of a somber note to start on, I apologize, but a very important note, I believe, for us to start today's conversation with Professor Hecker. And with that, I do pass the microphone over to him to start the lecture.
Very good, Charlotte. Thank you very much. And how nice it is to see, at least I can see some number of you, and I'll scroll down to keep an eye on all of you. So it's a great pleasure to once again join the Monterey Seminar Series on Russia. I've done that every year for the last, I think just about since Professor Vasilyeva started this. So it's always been my great pleasure. And I look forward to your questions. I was asked this year to sort of look back and look at nuclear cooperation between the Russians and the American nuclear scientists. So what you just saw, by the way, was not my selection, but since it was Trinity Day today, so in fact, just a few hours ago, not too far from where I'm sitting right now, I'm sitting in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is close to Los Alamos, and not quite 200 miles north of where the Trinity explosion took place 75 years ago. And as you heard in the video, it said 65 years ago, because that video was made 10 years ago, and it was offered by Bob Fry to Professor Vasilyeva to perhaps show it on this day, the 75th anniversary. So while we're on anniversaries, let me also tell you, this is actually the 55th anniversary of when I first came to Los Alamos. And that was in late June of 1965, as I just graduated from Case Tech, now Case Western Reserve University, and I came out here for a summer internship at Los Alamos, and that introduced me to things nuclear, about which I knew very little before then. And then I've been here at Los Alamos off and on for all of that time. Of course, went back to graduate school, worked in a couple of places, and I've been at Stanford since 2005. But I've always kept an office at Los Alamos, and I spend summers and some of the winters here as well. So my career then took me from a Los Alamos grad student to Los Alamos postdoc, to Los Alamos scientist coming back in 1973, being involved in all of Los Alamos's program, from weapons to civilian programs. And then for some strange reason, I wound up being director of Los Alamos in 1986. And it turns out, of course, as you well know, being students of Russia and Russian history, that's when things changed quite dramatically in the Soviet Union. And so in essence, I was here as Los Alamos director during the final days of the Soviet Union, and then during the startup of, once again, of the Russian Federation and the other 14 states of the former Soviet Union. And so I've had lots and lots of interactions with my Russian nuclear colleagues. And what I'd like to tell is this story. And it's the story we've captured in a book, which is called Doomed to Cooperate. And it's the story of American and Russian nuclear scientists, nuclear weapon scientists for the most part, telling the story of how we worked together at the end of the Cold War in order to help to mitigate the problems that arose from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so that's what I'm going to focus my talk on today. I've done much more with Russia, and of course with Soviet Union beforehand, and with Russia after, and also particularly since I've gone to Stanford, I've worked with essentially all of the other nuclear weapons states. And I've been in essentially all of those nuclear weapons states. including North Korea, actually. So in the Q&As, you know, if you want to get off to North Korea, I'm just writing a book, it turns out, right now, as we speak, on North Korea, including my 7 trips there. Okay, so let me get started. So the way that I like to start this particular presentation is to begin with the seminal event of August of 1991, which in a pretty quick order led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And of course, that was the putsch when Gorbachev was put under house arrest down in the Crimea. Yeltsin stood up on the T-72 tank in Moscow. The military decided to turn around. Gorbachev was allowed to come back, but this was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. And it had huge repercussions in the United States at the time because, as it was found out not too long afterwards, is that Gorbachev was actually relieved of what we call the nuclear suitcase, and that is the launch codes for the Soviet nuclear weapons. And so all of a sudden, what sort of went through the heads of American policymakers were the concerns as to what's going to happen if the Soviet Union actually does split up. And in fact, what it triggered, and there's a lot of fascinating history from that, you know, August timeframe into the timeframe that I show here, September and October, with involvement on the US side of congressional people, involvement on the Russian side of Russian Academy of Sciences. The NGOs, you know, the non-governmental organizations were particularly influential during this time on the American side. And then it led to what I thought was sort of one of the greatest political moves in terms of international security by an American president. And this was a unilateral move by President George H.W. Bush. And the way he announced it, actually he announced it first to Gorbachev in a phone call on September 27th. And in essence, what President Bush did was to sort of to tone down the nuclear threat from the US side. Unilaterally, he said he was going to take all weapons off the US surface, all nuclear weapons off the US surface ships, and made another several unilateral concessions. And then he turned to Gorbachev on the phone. And by the way, that phone call now has been declassified. And it's really a fascinating discussion where he said, well, Mikhail, you know, I hope you can also take actions. And Gorbachev, in typical Russian fashion, says, well, George, in principle, you know, I'm for all of these things. Well, it turns out he turned his in principle to saying, yes, he will do this. And he did that on a Russian TV address on October 5th of 1991. And those two actions, what we call presidential nuclear initiatives, really helped to tone down the threat that the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, must have felt during those very, very difficult days. And then what it led to on the American side, and if you studied nuclear things at all related to Russia, United States, you've heard of this program called Cooperative Threat Reduction, or the non-Lugar program. And indeed, through the involvement of non-governmental organizations, through the leadership of these two senators, Senator Sam Nunn on the right and Richard Lugar on the left, they crafted this legislation to actually allocate and appropriate $400 million where the American government would assist Russia in dealing with what? In the book that David Hoffman wrote called The Dead Hand, which is quite a superb book, dealing with what he called the inheritance from hell. In other words, the Soviet nuclear program. So what was, in their view, the inheritance from hell? Well, in sort of popular vernacular, one says loose nukes, loose nuclear materials, loose nuclear people, and loose nuclear exports. From a US point of view, as the US looked at the Russian, first Soviet, now Russian nuclear complex, it was all a matter of danger. There was nothing that was seen as a benefit from an American point of view. And so the American programs were targeted of preventing bad things from happening or eliminating as much as was possible of the Russian nuclear complex. So let's look a little more closely. It's important because that change was truly a sea change. And it was a sea change because before that time, people like me, director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, and of course many other Americans, we thought the threat came from the nuclear weapons being in the hands of the Soviet government. And then of course one can look back of Soviet, the Cuban Missile Crisis, etc. So it was the Soviet government and the nuclear weapons they had in their hands. Now, all of a sudden, with the Soviet Union essentially dissolving, the threat now was the nuclear assets, be they the weapons, the materials, the people, getting out of the hands of the government and perhaps into the hands of some other countries or possibly terrorists. So that's how the threat changed. And those are the things that I will tell you that my Russian colleagues and I together thought that needs to be addressed. Just to put some numbers on this, to give you an idea, the loose nukes at that time, we were talking about tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. At the height of the Soviet Union, they had on the order of 39,000 nuclear weapons, 39,000. You just saw the Trinity explosion. And then, of course, the two explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that followed about 3 weeks later, they killed altogether over 100,000 people. And of course, it was 2 cities destroyed, 1 bomb, 1 city destroyed. And we were talking about 39,000 nuclear weapons here. Of course, the Americans were no slouch either. We had somewhere around 25,000 nuclear weapons. And it's not that we fell behind, but we felt we, for the most part, had more accurate weapons and didn't need more. But no matter how you look at it, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in today's world just seems totally, totally crazy. But that's where we were. Nuclear materials, these are in my longer lectures, which I didn't have a chance to do today. I explained the whole nuclear business, but there are 2 paths to nuclear weapons. One is plutonium. You make plutonium in a reactor. If you extract the plutonium, it only takes on the order of 6 kilograms. In other words, a grapefruit size ball of plutonium. That's what destroyed Nagasaki. Highly enriched uranium is the other path. That was used in Hiroshima. It turns out you make a simpler bomb out of highly enriched uranium, but it takes more materials. And so today we think generally, one says, on the order of a few tens of kilograms it would take of highly enriched uranium. And I want you to look at this number, the fissile materials, namely plutonium, highly enriched uranium. The Soviet Union had on the order of 1.4 million kilograms of this stuff. 1.4 million kilograms. 6 kilograms destroyed Nagasaki. People. And of course, there was a concern about people. The country comes apart, the economy goes to pots. The whole social system that was there in the Soviet times disintegrates. What's going to happen to all the people? Altogether, there were about 1 million people in the Russian nuclear complex, military and civilian combined, and certainly several hundred thousands in the nuclear weapons community. And the question is, what will happen to those people? What will happen to the secrets that they know? And then exports. With a country coming apart, with the economy collapsing, will they sell essentially anything that's not nailed down? That's what was sort of the popular discussion in the United States at the time. So all of these, when you put them together, I think it's fair to say that when the Soviet Union dissolved, as we looked at this overall nuclear complex, this had the making of a perfect storm. So immediately, one of the first things that happened, you know, as you most likely know, is when the Soviet Union then dissolved into the 15 you know, former states of the Soviet Union, that actually nuclear weapons were stationed in 4 of those states, Russia, of course, but then also Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And actually at that time, Ukraine, with the weapons they wound up with because of the dissolution and getting their independence, they were the 3rd largest nuclear weapon state in the world. They had more nuclear weapons than any of the other states. And so the issue was, you know, what do you do? What do you do with those weapons? I mean, the brain trust for those weapons was back, you know, in the Russian Federation. And so actually one of the great cooperative programs as part of the non-Lugar program was to convince those 3 countries, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus, to give the nuclear weapons back to Russia and have them dismantled in Russia. And indeed, that happened. The US paid for much of that activity. And Secretary of Defense, William Perry, who actually wound up being my colleague at Stanford, because he was a professor there when I joined, he helped to make that happen. So that was a key step. That was mostly a government-related program. I'm going to now switch over to what I'm going to cover in the rest of the lecture, and that is the role of the scientists. And the scientists, we the scientists actually got to know each other first in something called the Joint Verification Experiment. They were actually 2 different nuclear tests. The one on the left carried out at the Nevada test site, August 17th, 88. The one on the right carried out in the Semipalatinsk test site on September 14th, 1988. That's where the primary Soviet nuclear test site was in the country now of Kazakhstan. What the Joint Verification Experiment was about is what had been on the books for 14 years since 1974 was what was called the Threshold Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And the 2 countries, Soviet Union and the United States, distrusted each other so much that they never ratified that treaty. Sounds a little bit like the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban, where we sit now, where that was signed in 1996. Actually, in this case, Russia ratified it. The US still has not ratified it. Well, we sat there for 14 years with an unratified treaty, and the claims were that, well, you can't really, you can't ratify it because you can't verify the threshold of a nuclear explosion from a distance. And that threshold was 150 kilotons, as it turns out. And so what we wound up doing is we got the scientists from their nuclear weapons lab, our nuclear weapons lab got together, and we did the experiment. Being in Nevada, we put a Los Alamos nuclear device downhole. We set it off. We had the Russian scientists on site, you know, our super secret test site in 1988, and they did an on-site measurement of the explosive yield. And then some NGO groups did some off-site seismic measurements. And in essence, what we were able to prove is the off-site seismic measurements were good enough. And then we flipped the whole thing and did the same thing in Russia. They detonated one of their devices. Our scientists were there. There are lots of interesting stories associated with that, because I was sitting in the control room when we set this thing off, and I had the Russian scientists right across from me. The reason I show it here is because it was the first time that we really met the Russian nuclear weapons scientists face to face. Even though, as I think you just heard from your lectures from Professor Sagdeev, for example, there was lots of interaction of scientists between Soviet Union and the United States before this time, but never had we collaborated with Russian nuclear weapons scientists, and we did here. And in fact, that then led to the verification negotiations in Geneva. From Geneva, the lead technical expert on the Russian side, Viktor Mikhailov, invited our scientists to come to the Russian Los Alamos and to the Russian Livermore Laboratory, as we call it, Lawrence Livermore Laboratories. The equivalent of Russian Lawrence Livermore Laboratory is in Snezhinsk. It's called ViniTF for technical physics at the end. And the equivalent of Los Alamos, the first Russian laboratory, was in Sarov, and that's ViniF. And so our scientists were there, and it was simply amazing. You see the bonfire, you see them sitting under the tent. It was as if they had known each other for years. And then I was able to convince the US government, as the Soviet Union was literally falling apart in December of 1991, that we could have an exchange of laboratory directors, in other words, exchange visits, and that is allow the Russian laboratory directors to come to the United States and to allow us, myself and my colleague John Knuckles from Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, to go and visit the Russian nuclear labs. And here the Russians are, and the US on the left, they are at a big laser at Livermore. On the right, we have the typical photo op with myself sitting in the center back in my mustache days in the United States in February of 1992. And then just a couple of weeks later, I was there, and I was able to go to Sarcophagus, or Azimuth 16 as it was called. Sakharov called it the installation. Before that, they called it KB11. There are many, many names, but it's now in the city of Sarov. And here's the person we call the Russian Oppenheimer, and this was Yuri Borisovich Hariton, who headed their science program from the birth of the laboratory in 1946 to 1992, shortly after I arrived. And so here we are on the tarmac in Sarov, and then we were toured through the laboratory. Again, it's a long and it's a fantastic story of that visit of a few days. We went on from Sarov, we flew to Snezhinsk, and actually we flew into Yekaterinburg, and then took the bus down, their bus, of course, down to Snezhinsk. And again, there we had these incredible discussion. And now again, remember, this was just less than 2 months after the Soviet Union broke up. And we, the scientists, are there saying, hey, look, we have these new problems, especially now, you know, as all of these weapons are coming back, they're gonna be dismantled, you know, disassembled. And the most dangerous phase of a nuclear weapon is it when it comes back and when you actually have to take it apart. And so we got together, and this is the list of things that we recommended. I was told by the US government before I left, they said, look, Hecker, don't sign anything when you go to Russia, because of course there was still enormous distrust of Russia. The fact that we got to go was quite unusual, but they said, do not sign anything. Well, it turns out, you know, since you all know Russia, well, you can't go to Russia and not sign something. I mean, you know, we had to sign something. What we signed was this, which was quite amazing. We were going to work together on weapons safety and security in transport and dismantlement as these things come back from Europe, for example, or from the other states, and then as they're dismantled. We're going to work together to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear terrorism. What about emergency response? Safety of the weapons remaining in the stockpile. And then what about cleaning up the mess, you know, of the huge complexes on each side. And by the way, this wasn't just for Russia, this was both sides. So we signed this, I brought this back to Russia. I was told in the National Security Council in the White House, they took this document, crumpled it and threw it in the waste paper basket and said, there's no way we're gonna do these things. However, what they did allow, with much nagging, was to say, all right, you guys can work together on fundamental science. You know, if you want to do that, you can do so. And so we said, okay, that's good enough. We'll start working together on fundamental science. And that's what we did. So for example, here are just some of the photos of the visits to their laboratory. And the question, you know, as one looks back, is to say now, why were we all interested in doing this? I mean, we were the weapons guys, right? They were sort of, you know, like two scorpions poised at each other. And so why would these nuclear weapons scientists all of a sudden actually want to work together? And so here's my take on that. So as we look on the US side, well, there is no question. I mean, we were immensely concerned about the loose problem, the loose nukes, materials, people exports. And so we thought they're going through this traumatic change of life, and can we work with them to help them? Because if any of those things get away, it's going to be bad for the entire world, not just for Russia. And quite frankly, from my standpoint, it was curiosity. You know, for heaven's sakes, we had this, you know, Cold War, the Soviet Union, you know, closed up. And even though we got some peeks into the Soviet Union through some cooperation in the scientific world, we didn't know what their nuclear weapons labs were like. We didn't know what their people were like. So it was curiosity. On the Russian side, as you probably heard in the lectures earlier this morning, you know, the Soviet scientific enterprise was absolutely first class. You know, a number of Nobel laureates and many of their great scientists got their education, particularly the physicists and the great European schools of physics. And indeed, so did the Americans. But starting in 1945, they were isolated. They wanted to end isolation, especially the nuclear weapons people. They wanted to pay their people because just like the rest of Russia, economic hardship was just amazing. And then they themselves were worried about, you know, mitigating the nuclear danger. They said, we know how to take weapons apart, but we've never taken that many apart. And then hope. The fact that we came, the fact that we shook hands, the fact that we would work together during this enormously depressing time actually was a ray of hope for their scientists. And then, again, this was not appreciated in the United States, but the Russian weapons scientists, they had this enormous sense of global responsibility. So that's what was driving both sides. Oops. Oops. Okay. And then I would say, I would add to that, and then as scientists like to do, it's to discover, to create. And as engineers aren't so much into the discovery, engineers want to build things. And so both the scientists and engineers, you discover, you create, you want to build things together. So we all of a sudden sort of being let out of our cage, you know, after all those decades, being locked up on each side in some ways. This was an opportunity to work together. Okay, so now that's why we did it. How did we do it? It's what we call lab to lab, scientist to scientist, shoulder to shoulder is what the Russians like to call it. And so since we worked together and we did experiments together. We went to their, you know, secret cities, Sarcophagus, Snezhinsk, behind their security fence. They came to Los Alamos, to Lawrence Livermore, behind our security fence. Of course, we didn't show them any secrets. They didn't show us any secrets, but we needed the equipment, the facilities in those places. So we got a view from the inside, you know, what I'd call boots on the ground, or maybe boots sounds too military. I should change that to feet on the ground. Okay, so what happened once we got a chance to be in there and to work with them side by side, and we had our scientists who lived over there in Sarov for weeks at a time working together, we found that the Russian view of their nuclear enterprise was totally different. This was not an inheritance from hell. It was felt to be the means of revival. So these Russian nuclear weapons scientists, they saw their country sort of going down. They said, we can help to revive our country. We have the intellectual capabilities. We have the people. So the nuclear weapons were seen, this is going to guarantee Russia's sovereignty, at a time where Soviet Union came apart. Nuclear materials, you can use uranium, you can use plutonium for civilian nuclear production. The nuclear scientists, engineers, they were among the best trained in all of the Soviet Union. They were going to be the engine of Russia's economic recovery. And then for nuclear exports is one of the few things that they would actually have to sell that weren't their natural resources. Okay, so then here are the other things. We also, we said, look, we cooperate to do good, not just to prevent bad things. We're quick, we're flexible, we can work together, which indeed we did. So for example, this is behind the fence in Sarcophagus in Russia. And we're doing a magnetic flux compression experiment. Standing around this, this particular device are as many Americans as there are Russians inside of Russia. This was actually a device that Sakharov invented back in the early 1950s. It's to put explosives around a place where you're going to generate a magnetic field through an electric current, and then you're going to compress that magnetic field, and you're going to generate super high magnetic fields. And that's exactly what happens here. So the person looking straight at you is Steve Younger. He was my lead scientist in Sarcophagus. And on the left was Sasha Bikov, and he gives them a typical Russian bear hug because they just generated the highest magnetic field on Earth through those experiments together. And then here we did side by side, as I mentioned, instead of trust but verify, which was Reagan's famous phrase, we said, no, trust and benefit from that trust, actually get something out of it. We had a continuity of effort, governments come and go. We scientists sort of hang on forever. And then we had a window of opportunity and we took advantage. Okay, I realize that I'm having so much fun giving you this lecture that I'm gonna run out of time pretty quickly. So I'll go through this quite rapidly. And just the four big things. So what did we actually do? Well, we worked the loose nuke problem. So for example, one of the big problems in getting for the Russians to get their nuclear weapons back, to Moscow or to their disassembly facilities, where they were concerned about terrorism. So the Sandia National Laboratory people, the third of the US national weapons laboratories, helped them with Kevlar blankets. That was a fantastic effort. The Livermore people actually had this incredible suggestion for the Russians were saying, look, when we take these nuclear weapons apart, the parts tend to get stuck to each other, and we have a difficult time mechanically prying these things apart. And as we had a workshop on disassembly, one of the Livermore scientists, one of the chemists says, oh God, you don't need to use mechanical, just use this. It's a common solvent. It's called DMSO, dimethyl sulfoxide. And it will just, you put it in there, it'll just have your stuff come apart. The Russians said, you've given us a gift. So there were hundreds of these type of projects. Loose nuclear materials, quite frankly, that was my biggest concern. And that's one that I worked personally the most. And actually here I am signing agreements for nuclear materials protection, control, and accounting. Here I am with Vladimir Belugin at VNIF, and with Yevgeny Avrorin from VNITF, and with Nikolaevich Ponomaryov-Stepnoy from the Kurchatov Institute. We started this program for the next 20 years. US spent about $4 billion. We work closely with the Russian scientists in order to have them protect their nuclear materials, which they did. And the nuclear materials were all over, for the Russian sites and many other places. And of course, they protected those materials themselves, but we shared our technologies, our methodologies. I won't have time to discuss this in great detail. This was probably the single most important project I was involved in with the Russians and then also the Kazakhs. This is the Semipalatinsk test site where the Soviet Union did, as you can see here, 456 nuclear tests over the years, underground, high altitude, many others. And then as the Soviet Union dissolved, 25,000 soldiers went home to Russia. And this place was left not guarded very well. And in fact, here's an indication. I try to work with my Russian colleagues to say, could you guys, in '98, could you guys come back with us to Semipalatinsk and tell us if you left anything behind that you're worried about that the Kazakhs now have to fix? And my Russian colleagues said, we're not going back ever to Semipalatinsk, because it turns out the Kazakh government was trying to get reparations for the mess that the Soviet Union made on the Semipalatinsk test site. So I finally went back with the help of some Kazakh friends, and this was the main guard gate going to the test site. And my Kazakh friend had told me that, look, we're concerned because we have copper cable thieves on the test site. And I said, what do you mean? And I said, well, there are people out there, you know, they're excavating the place and they're trying to take the copper, of which there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of that, in order to sell it to the Chinese and to others. And so when I got there, I was expecting, you know, the Kazakhs, as you know, are nomads. I was expecting guys on camelback, you know, pulling on copper cable. But that's not what I found. What I found was this: these trenches of hundreds of kilometers dug with modern machinery. And so the concern was, what's at the end of one of those copper cables? Because the Soviets did a lot of experiments out on the test site. So for 15 years, we worked very closely with Russians, with Kazakhs together, Triparty arrangement. Here's one place where the Soviets had done a lot of plutonium experiments, not nuclear explosions, but plutonium experiments, and they left them in the ground because it was too hard, too difficult, and to some extent dangerous to pull out. So we worked with the Kazakhs and with the Russians. The Russians helped to point out the places. We helped to pay and to make sure there was a real proliferation concern. And the Kazakhs did the actual physical work. In this case, they put a sarcophagus over this place. And I show you the next photo just to emphasize one of the most important things in any of our cooperations, and it was the human dimension, the people to people. And on the right is my colleague Phil Himberger, who took over the Kazakh Semipalatinsk work. On the left is Yuri Styachkin. He's one of the Viniev scientists who did those experiments out in Kazakhstan. And he felt it was his moral responsibility to go back out, of course, with approval. You know, eventually he got approval so that he could go from the Russian government. And here they're having a couple of beers and some speck and some other things together in a hotel room. And this, and by the way, as I'll point out in a minute, in the book of the Doomed to Cooperate, Viktor Stepanek, who was one of the colleagues of Styachkin, wrote this and essentially says, look, we managed to liquidate, to take care of a problem of about 100 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium dispersed over the test site. Let me just put that in context. The North Koreans today, you know, as much of a problem as we have with them, have less than 50 kilograms of plutonium. Okay, so the people part, again, that was really crucial. That's what President George H.W. Bush was mostly concerned about, is what about the brain drain? Where are those people going to go? We work with them closely. Here's just this whole list of these experiments we did together on the Sakharov type experiments, and also magnetized target fusion experiments. Just fantastic. As I show you here, we did over 400 publications and presentations together, US and Russian. I personally worked with the foremost Russian plutonium metallurgists, because that was my background also, Lydia Timofeeva, and we worked together. We published an article called The Tale of Two Diagrams, because we had two very different views of how you make plutonium behave. So looking back, you know, you can ask the question, well, so was it worth it? Particularly, you know, today, as I'll show you on the US side, people will say, hey, look, you know, we worry about the Russians, they're building new nuclear weapons and so forth. Why in the world did we spend, the total CTR budget was something like $12 billion. And this is what I tell them in return. Loose nukes, there are tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. The best we know, not one got away. Loose nuclear materials, there was a little leakage, but very, very little. It's just amazing. Loose nuclear people, no significant nuclear brain drain. You hear a few stories. It's not any worse than the United States, quite frankly. And nuclear exports, some problems in the beginning in the early 90s, but also not a major problem. And so whatever money we spent, whatever effort the Russians put in, this is the bottom line. Now, no disaster, why? You know, with the Americans, with many Americans, well, we paid them, we put the money in, you know, we made this happen. Well, it turns out that's only part of the story, and it's not the main part of the story. The main part of the story are the Russian nuclear workers and their nuclear military were professional, patriotic, dedicated, responsible, and then in sort of the Dostoevskian sense, willing to endure hardship. At times when I went over there, you know, not being paid for 6 months. By the way, I've been over there since 1992 to last year in Russia altogether 57 times. So I've spent a lot of times in Russia. The US government took important cooperative measures. We need to look at that today and have the US government rethink about, we did these things. President Bush, Nunn-Lugar, President Clinton did the important things. And then the scientific communities on both sides stepped in just in time, this lab-to-lab cooperation. So it's been for 25 years. So on the right is Lev Dmitrovich Ryabev. He was former first deputy minister of atomic energy, once upon a time the director of VNIF in Sarov. And the title of the book came from this comment that he made. He says, we arrived in the nuclear century all in one boat. A movement by one will affect everyone. He said, we were doomed to work together. I took that and made it into the title. We were doomed to cooperate. And we did. And then by 2014, everything had essentially come apart, particularly from February on with the Crimea annexation, and things changed. This is a photo I took when I was there in April 2014. I've stayed in touch with my Russian colleagues. We finished a book after this, but we've never gotten back any word to what we used to do, because actually already starting in 2001, the Russian government wanted to make sure they kept the Americans out of their nuclear facilities. After 2015, not only out of the nuclear facilities, but away from the Russian nuclear experts. And by the way, their nuclear facilities, they've been in our nuclear facilities as much as we have been in their nuclear facilities. And so now what we actually have is Moscow, and particularly under Putin, is rewriting the narrative of this remarkable cooperation. Here's the cover of the book. On the left are the Russian, my colleagues, their reaction to the book, because it turns out they had to back out of co-editing the book, even though half of the articles are written by the Russian nuclear scientists. When they finally saw this book, you can see what their reaction was. They were shocked, but they were shocked because it is so good. It took them back to the glorious days of our cooperation. But now Putin's changing the narrative. He says in the 1990s, the Americans took advantage of our weakness. This whole cooperative threat reduction was an intelligence operations. It was to get access to the holiest of our holy nuclear sites. It turns out, quite frankly, that's just baloney. And he's even said, and not only Putin, but others have said, you know, they never got into our facilities. It's not true. I personally toured Russian nuclear weapon lab director through our closed nuclear plutonium facilities. We had them at our test site. We had them at, actually, we had them at our nuclear weapons assembly site. We always felt we had to do things in parallel. But it's not only the Russians. Today, it's also the Americans. And you know what you see in American, particularly in Congress, is you hear that, look, we spent $12 billion on the CTR program. And what it did was it just helped the Russian nuclear establishment. It kept them alive. In return, they've now fielded these 3 new nuclear weapon systems that threaten the United States. And just to boot, they violated every arms control agreement. So the narrative is being changed on both sides. Cooperation has gone down, and that is a real pity. And here's what Ryabe finally said. It's our job is to convince the respective leadership. We have to work together. The alternative, suspicion, return to an arms race, increased tension. Well, it turns out that's exactly what has happened from the time that he has said that in 2015. And so today, I view that everything nuclear, whether you want to get the best out of the atom in terms of nuclear electricity, nuclear medicine, or whatever, or you want to avoid the worst of the atom, you have to cooperate. We must cooperate together, and somehow our governments need to figure out how we can get back to that. So the best that I can do today, because we're getting no help from either government, is we essentially look to all of you, and that is the next generation. And so thanks to Rector Mikhail Strikhanov from MIFI, Stanford and MIFI have what we call this Young Professional Nuclear Forum, where we exchange about a dozen Americans and a dozen Russians. We go to each other's places, to Stanford, to MIFI, and we look at issues of nuclear cooperation, of nuclear threat. We do exercises together, and we've actually written a number of papers. I'm just finishing the editing of a number of papers that will go into the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist that looks at the legacy of the 3 big nuclear reactor accidents, and that is 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And these young folks have written those articles. In June of 2019, they also wrote a series of articles, 8 articles in the Bulletin on the future of nuclear power. So since we can't get our governments to cooperate, this is where we are. So Talat, I'm gonna stop right here. And I know you have the tradition of a break. And so you, it's in your hands, and you tell them when they got to come back, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.